For the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, the exit from the European Union means one of the most serious strategic path changes since the Second World War, with far-reaching effects on its economy and politics, as well as its cohesion and its international position. In view of the close vote of 52 to 48% for Brexit, the exact structure of relations with the EU and Great Britain has become a sharp line of domestic political conflict. Brexit is not a single event, but a long-term process that took place within the EU from the referendum in June 2016 to the formal exit in January 2020 and is still ongoing. In some areas, the new relationship with the EU is still being negotiated, until recently, for example, with regard to Northern Ireland, whose border with the Republic of Ireland has become an external EU border as a result of Brexit. Even 7 years after the exit vote, only an interim conclusion can be drawn as to how Brexit has affected the United Kingdom and also its politics and its economy. One challenge is that the actual implementation of Brexit, with exit from the internal market, the customs union and all other EU policies, took place after a transitional phase at the turn of the year 2020 and 21. That means in the middle of the COVID pandemic. This masked many of the effects of the withdrawal and made their assignment more difficult. As a result, the actual impact of Brexit remains highly controversial. Before analyzing the consequences of the exit, it should be emphasized that many of the consequences are primarily related to the nature of the exit. In the election campaign before the referendum, the Brexit supporters, the Vote Leave campaign, deliberately did not commit themselves to any variant of future relations with the EU, but promised the British people, among other things, largely unchanged access to the EU internal market. The government under Prime Minister David Cameron, who had made the referendum possible in the first place, but spoke out against Brexit, had not made any preparations for the eventual exit, although they always argued with high economic costs. As a result, the Kingdom first had to negotiate how it wanted to, structure the exit and the future relations with the EU. The possibilities ranged from close ties based on Norway's model with membership in the European Economic Area and almost complete access to the internal market, through to the conclusion of bilateral agreements based on the Swiss model, to the establishment of a customs union such as exists between Turkey and the EU, and to negotiate an intensified free trade agreement such as Canada maintains with the EU, for example. Finally, there was the option of a no-deal Brexit. That means an exit without an agreement, in which the United Kingdom would have left the EU without any regulation of future relations. With this spectrum, Cameron's successor Theresa May initially campaigned for an exit from the internal market and from the customs union. However, she negotiated an exit agreement that provided for a connection to the EU customs area and EU regulations via a clause on the border with the Republic of Ireland, her kind of Northern Ireland Protocol, which is why it failed several times in the British Parliament due to resistance from her own party. After May's fall in July 2019, the advocates of a hard Brexit led by Boris Johnson first gained acceptance in the Conservative Party, and after the new elections in December 2019, also in Parliament. The absolute majority won, and it gave Boris Johnson the political support to negotiate a harder Brexit with the EU, with a free trade agreement without tariffs or volume restrictions, but with a clear separation from all EU regulation and the reintroduction of far-reaching non-tariff trade barriers. The Trade and Cooperation Agreement between the EU and the United Kingdom entered into force on January 1st in 2021 provisionally and finally on May 1st. Great Britain is therefore further away from access to the EU internal market and further joint political cooperation than Norway, Switzerland, Turkey, or even the Ukraine. There is broad consensus in economics that Brexit will have negative economic consequences for the United Kingdom. In politics, however, the extent and severity of these consequences are disputed. Even before the Brexit referendum, the immense costs were the main argument of those in favor of remaining. In the goods sector in particular, the EU is by far the most important trading partner for the United Kingdom. Added to this is the interdependence of the British economy with the EU countries that has been built up over decades. In 2016, British Finance Minister or Chancellor of the Exchequer George Osborne therefore warned of a long-term loss of prosperity of up to 6% of gross domestic product for the British economy in the event of an exit. These calculations were dismissed by Brexit advocates as Project Fear. They argued that the UK would emerge stronger from Brexit through detachment from EU regulation and the reallocation of previous payments into the EU budget, for example, for investments in the chronically underfunded National Health Service. You remember the red bus. But in the meantime, the negative scenarios have come true. There was no catastrophic damage immediately after the referendum. Although the pound lost significant value, there was initially neither a recession nor an extreme rise in unemployment. In fact, Great Britain only left the customs union and the single market at the end of the transition phase in January 2021, when all of Europe was already in the middle of the corona pandemic and the economy was already badly affected. With the Russian war of aggression against Ukraine from February 2022 and the associated upheavals on the European energy market, as well as sharply rising inflation, there were additional challenges that are still an economic burden for all European countries today. Nevertheless, some consequences of Brexit can already be identified in a long-term comparison. At the beginning of 2023, the United Kingdom is the only G7 economy that has not yet reached the economic level of 2019. That means before the pandemic and Brexit. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development also forecasts that the UK economy will grow less than any other advanced economy over the next 2 years, apart from heavily sanctioned Russia. The Bank of England cites Brexit, in particular the associated permanent devaluation of the pound and the decline in investments, as one of the causes of the country's current economic difficulties. The Office for Budgetary Responsibility, which is also independent, assumes that the British economy will weaken by 4% as a result of Brexit. And according to a study by the British Centre for European Reform, Brexit even led to a 5.5% loss of prosperity in the United Kingdom by mid-2022. This is roughly in line with the cost forecast by the UK Treasury in 2016. However, the current British government rejects these calculations and cites the pandemic and the war in Ukraine as the main causes of the current economic difficulties. However, this does not explain the differences to other European countries which are also suffering from the pandemic and the consequences of war and inflation. The effects in Great Britain naturally differ depending on the sector and the degree of previous integration into the EU internal market. The British automotive industry, which is deeply involved in trans-European supply and production chains, stands out in particular. In 2022, the level of new car production fell to 1956 levels. Since 2016, it has fallen from 1.3 million to 775,000 cars. And there are also significant effects with regard to the shortage of skilled workers. Labour migration from the EU has become significantly more difficult, which was a main goal of Brexit supporters under the famous motto, "Take back control." While immigration figures from the rest of the world have remained high, immigration from the EU has decreased noticeably. At the same time, many EU citizens have migrated, despite the retention of their employment rights through the exit agreement. As a result, the United Kingdom is short of around 330,000 workers in net terms. One area in which Brexit advocates feel vindicated is in the UK's trade deals. With the withdrawal from the internal market and the customs union, the country has also withdrawn from all trade agreements the EU has negotiated with other countries. In the transition phase, it was possible to convert some of them into separate agreements, some with better conditions from the point of view of the British government, but most with worse. In addition, further agreements have been negotiated with Australia, for example, or the negotiations are more advanced than from the EU, for example, with India. So far, however, all of this has not been able to compensate for the loss of participation in the EU internal market. A trade agreement with a partner with the greatest economic potential, the United States, is still not in sight. By contrast, British efforts to join the Trans-Pacific Free Trade Agreements, the CPTPP, had a better chance of success, although it will not bring that much. At least as strong as the economic consequences of Brexit are its effect on British politics and the cohesion in the United Kingdom. Since leaving the EU, there has not been a full legislature. Instead, there have been two snap elections in 2019 and 2017, as well as the resignations of 5 prime ministers: David Cameron, Theresa May, Boris Johnson, Liz Truss, four, and a series of unprecedented government defeats despite majorities in Parliament. The first phase after the Brexit referendum was initially characterized by fierce power struggles in the Conservative Party among the Tories themselves. Originally, then Prime Minister and party leader Cameron promised an EU referendum to end intra-party struggles over EU membership. This division was also evident in the referendum itself. A good 2/3 of Tory MPs were against Brexit, but around a third were in favour of it. The most prominent representatives of both campaigns were Tories with David Cameron and George Osborne in the Remain camp, and Boris Johnson and Michael Gove on the Vote Leave side. But instead of being pacified by the referendum, the power struggle within the party intensified massively. In the struggle for Cameron's successor May, a politician who had spoken out against Brexit before the referendum, prevailed. However, she fully recognized the result, spoke out in favor of leaving the single market and the customs union, and sought a balance between Remain and Leave advocates in her cabinet, including Boris Johnson as Foreign Secretary. However, she never managed to achieve this balance, and in the course of the negotiations with the EU, resistance within the party to possible compromises grew. The exit agreement negotiated by May was rejected 3 times in the House of Commons, which ultimately forced her to resign and enabled her successor Johnson to put together a cabinet of Brexiteers who, if in doubt, also had to agree to the option of a no-deal Brexit. In the new elections in December 2019, Johnson won a clear majority with his slogan "Get Brexit Done" and the promise that Brexit would do more to combat immigration and the hardships of globalization. This also changed the political orientation of the Conservative Party, and for all. All the new MPs were clear advocates of a hard Brexit. And through this metamorphosis, the Tories have become the Brexit Party, but also moved to the right of the political spectrum overall. Closely linked to the Tory power struggle was a constitutional conflict between government and parliament. The UK political system is a constitutional monarchy based on the principle of parliamentary sovereignty. However, due to the electoral system, which usually produces absolute majorities, the workings of parliament are largely controlled by the government, for example, in relation to the agenda and voting documents. Before the new elections in December 2019, Johnson, like May before him, did not have his own majority for his Brexit policy. Cooperation with the opposition was rare, and in a notable exception, a cross-party lower house majority passed legislation in early September 2019, forcing the government to ask the EU for another extension of the negotiation deadline, rather than a no-deal Brexit. However, there was no majority for one of the alternatives, a new government or new elections. Shortly thereafter, the Prime Minister sent Parliament into an enforced break to prevent further interventions against his Brexit course. Only after a ruling by the Supreme Court was Parliament able to reconvene and finally pass legislation to prevent a no-deal Brexit. Only then did Johnson find a parliamentary majority for new elections and was able to restore the usual relationship between Parliament and government with his election victory. In subsequent decisions, such as the procedures for negotiating new trade agreements, the government enforced a limitation of parliamentary rights, while extensive executive powers were delegated to ministers without parliamentary participation in many aspects of the post-Brexit settlement. All in all, Brexit has therefore contributed to a weakening of Parliament in the British system, and that despite the emphasis placed on parliamentary sovereignty by the Brexit advocates. So the Brexiteers damaged that what they always blamed the EU for, which was a lie. But they did that themselves, and that is the interesting part of it. Nevertheless, Brexit, as I said in the beginning of the video, is not a thing that happens once and then it's over. Brexit will not be over for a very long time, and we will have to deal with Brexit for a very long time as well. And if you want to see some more Brexit or other UK politics stuff right now, the next video is right here in the end screen. I'll see you there. I'll be back.